The Urbanist is brought to you in association with the Department of Culture and Tourism, Abu Dhabi. Saadiyat Cultural District Abu Dhabi is a beacon of hope and inspiration. A catalyst to spark growth and collaboration with museums and experiences, where art and science and nature and technology coexist.
The belief of Abu Dhabi that culture is the backbone of our society.
Stay tuned for a special episode of the show, in which you can hear His Excellency Mohammed Khalifa Al Mubarak explain exactly why and how Saadiyat Cultural District Abu Dhabi is the perfect place to collaborate, create and innovate. Saadiyat Cultural District Abu Dhabi, proud partner of The Urbanist on Monocle Radio.
Hello and welcome to The Urbanist, Monocle's programme all about the built environment. I'm your host, Carlotta Rebello. Coming up.
Monarchs were very, very intensely interested in architecture. They might not actually have held the pencil themselves, so to speak, but they were kind of like Louis XIV, standing over the shoulder of his gardener.
Throughout history, kings and queens have commissioned buildings all around the world. But just how much has their visions shaped the cities of today? This week we peel open the pages of a new book, Royalty and Architecture, delving into the impact monarchs have had on the built environment, from Gustav III of Sweden in the 18th century to modern-day UK under King Charles III, and how they have shaped architectural policy still used today. Plus, we head to France to visit a place that saw everything from coronations to royal funerals and check on the rebuilding efforts of the Notre Dame Cathedral, 5 years on from a devastating fire. All that ahead coming up over the next 30 minutes right here on The Urbanist with me, Carlotta Rebello. So welcome to this week's episode. Royalty have always built castles, fortresses, parks and even entire cities. But just how much of today's urban environment is the consequence of an individual monarch's interest in architecture and, in some cases, of acting as an architect themselves? Clive Aslett is a writer on British architecture and life and a visiting professor of architecture at the University of Cambridge. He's also the editor of a new book called Royalty and Architecture, Visions and Ambitions of European Monarchs and Nobility, which looks at just how important monarchs have been for architectural policy and the vision that shapes much of the cities of today. Earlier, Clive stopped by the studio to speak with The Urbanist's Andrew Tuck, and Andrew began by asking him what the starting point was for the book.
Well, it was particularly true of Gustav III of Sweden, who was extremely interested in everything to do with the design. He loved theatre particularly, he loved costumes, this was very important to him, and he also spent all his time drawing, even in meetings with his courtiers and so on. He would be kind of drawing things in the margins of papers, and he left a considerable body of drawings. I mean, some of his buildings were built, and that was very unusual, and so were his garden designs put into execution. But he left these drawings, and they were obviously important. He was assassinated. It's actually the story of Verdi's Masked Ball, and his son had to abdicate and leave the country. And he took with him all his father's drawings, his collection of drawings. And these in the 20s were acquired by the Axon-Johnson family, who now have a wonderful foundation called the Axon-Johnson Foundation. And they commissioned a facsimile of all these drawings. It was very unusual that they're in private hands. They ought really to be owned by the state, but it's because Gustav's son abdicated. Anyway, they commissioned a facsimile of these drawings, some of which are sort of 9 feet long. And it's a one-to-one facsimile, so it's really extraordinary. They've also commissioned cabinets in which they could be put, because they're not something you can just put on a bookshelf. Anyway, they wanted to investigate this topic, and it's been extremely interesting, because it really hasn't been done before.
What's the difference for you between a monarch who maybe was commissioning architects and wanted their wealth, their splendour, their taste reflected in a building, and this slightly different thing, which is the monarch who actually wants to design it themselves, who wants to get in on the process?
Well, I think that the second type, characterised by Gustav, is pretty rare. And Gustav really was unusual. I mean, they had these court entertainments in Sweden called carousels, and they were like sort of tournaments with an element of mask or something like that. And, he would design the theatre sets and he designed the costumes and so on. Well, that was very unusual. But there were one or two kind of equivalent monarchs who, they only drew a little bit, really, to be quite honest, because they had other people who could do it for them. But what became apparent when Frank Salmon and I were editing the volume that we were asked to do was how many monarchs were very, very intensely interested in architecture, really quite a large number. They might not actually have held the pencil themselves, so to speak, but they were kind of like Louis XIV, standing over the shoulder of his gardener, discussing at every point what they were going to do. So, they would be called conceptual, I suppose, perhaps rather than executive.
What was it about architecture you think that appealed to these monarchs? Was it because they could reflect their education, their taste in architecture? Because there's a hint of, the classics and classicism in some of the buildings. There's references to past and heritage. What was it that appealed to, do you think, about architecture?
Well, I think that, Louis XIV told his son, the Dauphin, that the two things that monarchs were remembered for was warfare and architecture. He then came to slightly repent, because when he was talking to the person who would be his heir, who, believe it or not, was his great-grandson, Louis XV, he said, don't follow my example in terms of the amount of money I've spent on wars or architecture. So he did slightly repent. But I think that was a view that was shared between monarchs. In the early period, in the medieval period, for example, the relationship with God was extremely important. And so they wanted to do great things which were going to establish their relationship with God and no doubt help them, but help their country, because God was really just absolutely everywhere. And of course that had a political dimension as well, because when Thomas Becket was getting a great following, he was the one who had fallen out with Henry II. Henry III wanted to rebuild Westminster Abbey to Edward the Confessor, who very conveniently had been a king as well as a saint. So that was somewhere which was going to reassert his authority in the sphere of the spiritual realm, if you like. So I think that was something that was very important. Monarchs measured themselves by the standard of other monarchs. Until quite recently, there was absolutely no shame in showing off. You wanted to show off as much as you possibly could, because that showed that you were a king in charge of a very powerful country. And one of the things that was quite consistent was that people had the idea of the Roman Empire in their mind. And a lot of monarchs wanted to kind of measure up according to how they stood in terms of their buildings, because that's what Romans had done.
You mentioned there Louis XIV, and the excesses of his building are well known. How involved was he in the ambitions of the architecture that were produced in his reign?
Oh, he was very, very involved. It was tremendously important to him, and he would have plans sent after when he was on campaign. His great building project was obviously Versailles, which was kind of not advised by the people who looked after his money, for example, and they wanted him to live at the Louvre. But Versailles was a sort of hunting lodge in the middle of this marsh. It was, from every conceivable point of view, it was a bad place to build a palace. But, there was something about it because he could. Because he was the Sun King, he was going to do something which was completely impossible. It was very bad because water was a very big part of his idea for the garden. But there simply wasn't the volume of water, or particularly the height. There weren't any hills around to get the head of water for these great fountains. So he built an extraordinary machine of about, I think there were something like 28 watermills that were all connected, so that they were all going at the same time. They were all pumping this water. It still wasn't enough to really operate the gardens as he wanted to, and so they had to be rationed. He'd go for a walk with some important person before lunch. All the fountains were playing, and then they'd be switched off.
You also have a great chapter, Clive, about George IV and about his ambitions as an architect king. Here in Britain, we have the Brighton Pavilion, an amazing building, a celebration of Eastern influences that still, when you go past it, is something that kind of stops you in your tracks. Tell us a little bit about his ambitions as an architect king.
Architecture has been very much in his family, in the sense that his father, George III, had actually been trained as an architect by Sir William Chambers. And so he had been given lessons. And because he was very diligent, he took them seriously. He'd never achieved a great skill, but I think one of his very minor building was constructed. But architecture had been important to him as well, but he was a very kind of well-ordered king who didn't exceed his budget or anything like that, although he was quite interesting in his ideas. And first of all, he had buildings built by Chambers, and latterly he had buildings built in the Gothic Revival, because that was his image of the sort of ancient constitution of Britain. But George IV was of a quite different temperament. He was incredibly extravagant. In fact, he couldn't stop himself from buying things. And it was an absolutely extraordinary period because Britain was very, very rich. The French Revolution had recently taken place. So there was, for example, a tremendous amount of very, very high-end stuff which was available from France, and he bought it up like mad. But he just couldn't stop building. It was like a kind of mania, really, with him, practically. He was a great connoisseur. He certainly knew, he did once or twice say, well, you consider me the architect, but he wasn't really. But he did know a great deal about it, and he knew a great deal about everything in terms of collecting and taste, and he really, really loved it. He was highly extravagant. He built Carlton House, a palace there on the Mall, and then that was demolished. Buckingham Palace became the place, and he spent a total fortune. There's an absolute scandal on the amount of money that the architect Nash was spending there. But it could be said that he was certainly very, very much an influence on taste. He was a leader of taste, which can't be said of all British monarchs. And also, it was directly under his inspiration, if you like, that London was transformed in that period, because it was his land that saw a new route being carved from what became Regent's Park down to St James's Park, down Portland Place and Regent Street, and then onto, well, Carlton House Terrace as it is now. So he had a big impact on London, apart from anything else.
We'll return to the conversation between Clive and Andrew in a moment, but for now we're headed to Paris to visit a place that served as a setting for the coronation of almost 30 French kings, the Cathedral of Notre Dame. In 2019, a devastating fire engulfed the cathedral, damaging the spire and its roof. The images sent shockwaves around the globe as one of Europe's greatest monuments was suddenly at the risk of being erased. 5 years later, few would have believed that the structure would be repaired and rebuilt, but today Parisians are just a few months away from its grand reopening. Monocle's Emma Nelson ventured down to Notre Dame to report on how the world answered a call to save one of its most treasured buildings by using patience, the highest skills, and a love of singing.
Welcome to arguably the world's most beautiful building site. Fenced off from tourists, but with the work in full view of the world, Notre Dame and her restoration is taking centre stage in the heart of Paris. Powerful, elegant and eternal. You'd never guess that one day, 5 years ago, one of the West's greatest examples of civilization was within a matter of moments of being engulfed by flames forever. The French journalist Agnès Poirier was in her room, about 50 metres from Notre Dame, and she saw the devastation unfold.
Well, it was tragic and yet magnificent in the sense that people were just rooted on the ground like statues. I saw some huge yellow-brown plumes of smokes really from my kitchen window, and I knew something massive was happening. The tongues of fire coming out of the roof, and there were no firemen at that time, were so huge. It felt like you were looking at a Renaissance painting. So the moment was sublime and yet absolutely terrible.
The brothers Gédéon and Jules Naudet made their names when they captured the first plane striking the North Tower of the World Trade Center on 9/11. Now, disaster was unfolding in their home city.
You could see it in the faces of everyone around the world. That cry of anguish when the steeple fell. It was, I think, echoing something inside of us at a moment where almost everything was changing. Everything were losing kind of grasp on things we had taken for granted, or things the world changing around the world.
The motto of Paris firefighters is to save or to die, and never had that expression held more meaning than on the 25th of April 2019. Because at 9:30 in the evening, 150 firefighters went into the building, knowing they may never come out. The authorisation had come from President Macron himself.
I talked to General Gallet, who was the chief commander of the fire brigade in Paris, and he said the situation was so desperate. Audacity was the only response to it. And what happened is that he sent a sort of vanguard of 50 firemen up the North Tower, because the North Tower was already being eaten alive by the fire, and there are 8 bells there. And if the 8 bells had collapsed, the North Tower would have collapsed onto the South Belfry, which also has 2 enormous bells. One is the lowest pitch bell in the world, Emmanuel, it's called. And then basically the whole edifice would have collapsed like a house of cards.
The Naudet brothers made a documentary about the firefighters' efforts.
If the firefighters of Paris had not been at the right time, at the right place, sending this kind of suicide commando to extinguish the fire in a particular place, then yes, Notre Dame would not be here today. And those firefighters that were sent had all agreed and accepted the fact that they might not come back from this particular mission, but they succeeded.
Back on the Quai de Tournelle, I asked Agnès Poirier what might have been had the building not been saved.
It's impossible to fathom, to even contemplate, to imagine. The loss of Notre Dame, it's like imagine the loss of the pyramids in Egypt, or the loss of the Great Wall of China, or the loss of the Colosseum in Rome. It's something that the human mind cannot contemplate.
Within days, the stakes had been raised. The construction would have a time limit of 5 years. Agnès Poirier has been following the stories of those charged with the reconstruction. It's been set up like a military operation.
They are the best artisans in France. 1,000 of them are working every day, about 400 or 500 on site every day. When they say, okay, today we can do this, there's too much wind, we can't do this, it's too cold or it's raining, we cannot do this, but we can do other things. And so it's really a question, the pressure of time is a question of logistics rather than rushing your gargoyle, if you like, or your restoration. This is done properly.
What does it feel like when you're inside this? Because it is a building site, but it is an incredibly precious one.
The day I went, it was pouring with rain. Another day I went, it was 38 degrees. And people are beaming. And I think something very special is happening there, simply because, I tried to pierce that secret, asking people, I said, are you practicing Catholic? Is it something to do with God? And they said, no. A lot of them were Muslims or Jewish or atheist. And they said, no, this is about the beauty of Notre Dame. This is the chance of a lifetime.
And it's created a family, a musical one.
Do you know what? The artisans, all, very different ones, they have created a choir and they've taken to singing, and they will be singing on the 11th of December, and a lot of them were laughing because they had never sung in their lives. But there is the artisans choir, and apparently they're having a lot of fun.
The scaffolding will still be there, but the doors will open on the 8th of December 2024 at 11:30 a.m. for worship. For Monocle in Paris, I'm Emma Nelson.
Thanks, Emma. Now, let's return to our conversation between Andrew and Clive.
We jump to today, and we have a king, King Charles, who has always been intrigued and interested by architecture, and as Prince Charles made many interventions into the debate about what contemporary architecture should be, and also put his money down really to build Poundbury, to build these examples of what he felt should be the architecture and vernacular, especially of the British countryside. You've written a chapter about him, and I think you quite admire some of the stances that he's taken and his engagement with the debate.
Yes, I do. Nobody gets everything 100% right necessarily, but he's had bad luck because the media has never wanted to tell the story of what he's done. in a positive light. I mean, they've always been interested in other things, like particularly to do with his first marriage to Diana, and then whether Camilla was going to become queen. At one point, rather absurdly, people were talking about the prospect of him abdicating and the crown going straight to William. And nobody, or very few people, wanted to look at what he was doing for architecture, which is a pretty important subject, particularly as it's very obvious now that we need more houses. And he is actually one of the very few people who's come up with a very good answer. But that's just one of the things he's done in architecture, really astonishing. Over 40 years, he still is interested, but he's not really allowed to do it anymore because he's king. But over 40 years, he was interested at so many levels. I mean, you referred to the controversies which took place in the 1980s about the monstrous carbuncle on the face of my old friend, etc., which was the National Gallery. Well, he did win that battle. He won other battles. He established an institute to teach a different kind of architecture, which was highly enjoyable to the people who went there. Unfortunately, a lot of things got sacrificed when the stock of the royal family was very low after Princess Diana died, and that was one of the things that went. But Poundbury, nearly complete after, I think, about 30 years, that's only one of the things that the Duchy is doing. It's also doing an amazing development at Nansledden, outside Newquay in Cornwall, very poor place. They've built at Truro. They're wanting to build outside Faversham in Kent. I mean, it's a tremendous amount when you add it all together.
And some of the things seem very prescient now, reading your chapter. His belief in creating what we would call now walkable neighbourhoods. That he was keen to make places where the car wasn't king and was tucked away, and that there was space left on pavements for people to bump into each other and have conversations.
Yeah.
So he was thinking early on about loneliness and about engagement and community in a way, I guess, that now is top of the agenda for many architects.
Yes, I think that's entirely true. And he was so much ahead of the game with that. I mean, he was surrounded by a team of people that he was working with, but he had a very, very great personal interest. And, I mean, you would call him part of the architectural team because he saw every single drawing, possibly in a slightly obsessive way, but he had to see every drawing for everything that was built in these schemes by the Duchy. And yes, they were absolutely ahead of the game in terms of creating these places, which were really places. They weren't just a whole lot of houses thrown together where volume house builders put them up, sell them, and then move on. These are places which were very carefully thought out, where people could live all their lives at any stage of their lives, where people would put down roots and have a sense of community. I mean, if you take Nansledden, this one outside Newquay, that has a new high street with shops which are all thriving. I mean, everywhere else in the country, high streets are run down and closing. But there they're building a new high street. I mean, it's really remarkable.
And like Gustav III, a passion for the garden as well, a passion for what happens outside the buildings. In fact, maybe that's a bit of a link with nearly all of these monarch architects, that they were as big on the garden as they were on the house.
Well, of course, that's absolutely true, and kind of owning things and the control of nature that it gave them was very important. But I think in the case of Prince Charles, I mean, it is absolutely true. That's a very good analogy with Gustav III. But in the case of Prince Charles, I think it's become part of one big philosophical idea, which he describes as being harmony, that people would be happier if they lived in contact with nature and understanding its patterns and its rhythms and the wisdom that's passed down through the ages, which is tradition. And architecture, the architecture which he likes, which is made out of traditional materials and in correspondence with the proportions of the human body, is part of that philosophy. But the outside and the garden, his approach to gardens, is all part of the same thing, really.
I guess the reason that people kind of locked horns with, as he was then, Prince Charles, now King Charles, is because they felt that he was a bit of a handbrake on the move to modernity, that he didn't understand contemporary taste, etc., etc. When you look at many of the monarchs that appear in these books, and again, going back to King George, there was somebody who was actually pushing the boat out when it came to taste and flamboyance and decoration and all sorts of things. Do you think that Charles today is of a different mould, that he is harking back to a time before, or do you think that he's a moderniser as well?
Well, I think that he certainly has never liked modern architecture very much. But then if you think back to the 1970s, which was when I was at university and began my working career, it was really, really awful and nobody liked it. And there was a funny comment I came across that somebody said, well, of course, Charles's architectural education consisted of being driven around in the back of a Rolls-Royce and listening to his mother and grandmother saying, isn't all that awful? But actually, that's what everybody did. They didn't have a Rolls-Royce. But a lot of people were saying to each other, this is awful. But they couldn't do anything about it because the forces were so great and nobody was listening to what kind of ordinary people were saying. King Charles articulated that, which I think was important. But I think that although he was against modernism, doesn't like high buildings, for example, and he's no doubt appalled by what's happened to the skyline of London, as indeed many people are, he's very modern in other ways, because actually to be green is to be modern now, and he's very, very green. It's extraordinary. His garden at Highgrove used to be kind of rather neurotic because there were lots and lots of things going on, and it wasn't a calm place. But now all those different kind of areas have become engulfed in vegetation because he doesn't really want anything cut down. Even the house is kind of being submerged beneath these enormous creepers. And he says he likes that. Somebody told me that he once said that he quite likes the sense of being inside and he can look out, but people can't look in. It's a sort of Hansel and Gretel-ish kind of world. But, these things are cutting edge, really.
Just leave people with a final thought. When they go through this book, when they meet all the players in the different chapters, what do you want people to take away from this book? What's the reveal that people should get, really?
Well, I think that this subject has never been written about before, and so that's something. I mean, this is a collection of essays with many, many contributors, some of these very kind of specialists. But it is very fascinating that there is something which unites all these monarchs, which is that they want to leave, I think we now call it legacy. They wanted to leave their mark. This, for example, was true of Renaissance popes who were actually monarchs of the Vatican states, who undertook enormous building works in Rome, which was a very poor city, apart from the fact that the Vatican was very, very rich. I suppose that is also a theme, that monarchs wanted to make their cities and so on better, because they might be very poor. Sometimes they thought that just by spending money themselves or spending money on themselves, that kind of trickled down and helped poor people. I'm not sure that was really true. But this is a theme which unites so many monarchs. And also you can see it in so many cities today. I mean, London is a very good example. If you look at all the royal parks, Hyde Park and Green Park, these all started because they were royal, well, they still are royal parks. And streets today, Whitehall, that's where Whitehall Palace was. So, it's all embedded in the cities we're walking around today.
The writer Clive Aslett there in conversation with Monocle's Andrew Tuck. The book, Royalty and Architecture, Visions and Ambitions of European Monarchs and Nobility, is published by Bokforlaget Stolpe and is out now. And that's all for this week's episode of The Urbanist. Remember, you can get new editions of the show every week. Just follow us through your favourite podcast provider. And you can also subscribe to Monocle magazine for regular reports on all things design, architecture and urbanism. Just visit monocle.com. The Urbanist is produced by myself and by David Stevens, who also edits the show. Andrew Tuck will be back next week. I'm Carlotta Rebello. Goodbye, and thank you for listening, City Lovers.